In the 9th century before Christ, when the ancient Mediterranean was divided between the rising powers of Assyria and the fading kingdoms of the Bronze Age, a Phoenician princess named Elissa fled her homeland of Tyre with a small band of followers. The ancient sources call her Dido, and though myth has woven itself so tightly around her story that history and legend are now inseparable, her journey across the sea would spark the creation of an empire that would one day challenge the city on the Tiber itself. Elissa's flight began with blood and betrayal. Her brother Pygmalion, king of Tyre, had murdered her husband Acabas for his wealth, driving her into exile with whatever treasures and followers she could muster. The Phoenicians were already master navigators, their cedar ships carrying purple dye, glass and metalwork to every corner of the known world. But Elissa's voyage was different. This was not trade, but survival, a desperate search for a new home beyond the reach of her brother's assassins. The refugees sailed west, past Cyprus and Rhodes, past the Hellenic colonies of Sicily, until they reached the coast of North Africa. Here, near modern-day Tunis, Elissa negotiated with the local Berber King Yarbus for land. The king, perhaps amused by this small band of foreigners, agreed to sell them only as much territory as could be covered by an ox hide. But Elissa was clever. She cut the hide into the thinnest possible strips and arranged them in a circle, claiming a substantial hilltop that would become known as Bursa, from the Hellenic word for oxhide. Whether this tale of the oxhide is truth or poetry matters less than what it represents. From the very beginning, the Punic city was born of cunning and desperation, of people willing to sacrifice everything for a chance at something greater. The year was approximately 814 BC, and on that windswept hill overlooking a natural harbour, the greatest maritime empire of the ancient Mediterranean had begun. The early settlement was modest. Wooden buildings clustered around the harbour, workshops where craftsmen worked bronze and iron, simple temples where the colonists made offerings to their ancestral gods. But the location was perfect. The harbour provided shelter for ships, while the hill offered defensible ground. Most importantly, the site sat at the narrowest point of the Mediterranean, where Africa nearly touches Sicily. Any vessel travelling between the eastern and western halves of the ancient sea would pass within sight of the North African metropolis. Within decades, that strategic position began to pay dividends. Phoenician merchants from Tyre and Sidon recognized the potential of this new outpost and began using it as a base for their western ventures. Vessels arrived carrying cedar wood and purple dye from Lebanon, metalwork from Cyprus, and precious goods from the far reaches of the known region. They departed with silver from Spain, tin from distant Britain, and ivory from the African interior. The Punic settlers quickly learned to be more than mere middlemen. They established their own trading posts along the Spanish coast, particularly around the silver-rich region of Tartessos. They sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, venturing into the Atlantic to trade with the mysterious peoples of the north. Some scholars believe the Phoenician colony's galleys may have reached the British Isles and even the coast of West Africa, following currents and wind patterns that would not be rediscovered by Europeans for over 1,000 years. As wealth flowed into the city, the North African metropolis began to take on the character that would define it for centuries. This was not a conquest state like Assyria or Egypt, built on military domination and tribute. Instead, the Punic city was something new. A commercial empire held together by trade agreements, mutual benefit, and the simple fact that its merchantmen could reach places others could not. The city's power lay not in vast armies, but in its ability to connect distant markets and profit from the exchange. The political system that emerged reflected this commercial nature. The Phoenician colony was ruled by merchant aristocrats, families whose wealth came from trade rather than land. At the head of the state stood two annually elected magistrates called suffets, roughly equivalent to the Latin consuls. Below them was a council of elders and a larger assembly of citizens, though real power remained concentrated in the hands of the wealthiest families. It was an oligarchy, but one based on commercial success rather than military conquest. The religious life of early Punic civilization centered on deities inherited from their Phoenician homeland. Chief among these was Tanit, the goddess of fertility and the moon, whose symbol, a triangle topped by a horizontal line and circle, would become as recognizable as the city itself. Beside her stood Baal-Hamon, the lord of the burning flame, a god of sky and weather, whose worship would later scandalize Hellenic and Latin observers. These deities were housed in temples that grew more elaborate as the city's wealth increased, their precincts filled with the smoke of incense and the sound of ritual drums. But it was on the water that Carthage truly showed its character. The city's harbour was divided into two sections: a rectangular commercial port where merchant vessels loaded and unloaded their cargo, and beside it, a perfectly round military harbour that could shelter over 200 warships. This naval harbour was a masterpiece of engineering, with a circular island in the centre containing the admiral's headquarters and ship sheds arranged around the perimeter like the spokes of a wheel. From the sea, the military harbour was nearly invisible, hidden behind the commercial port and accessible only through a narrow channel that could be easily defended. The ships themselves reflected Carthaginian priorities. Their merchant vessels were broad and deep, designed to carry maximum cargo rather than win races. But their warships were among the finest in the Mediterranean, sleek galleys powered by multiple banks of oars and armed with bronze rams for sinking enemy vessels. Carthaginian captains developed innovative naval tactics, including the practice of breaking enemy oar banks by ramming them at an angle, a technique that required extraordinary seamanship and would serve them well in the wars to come. As the 6th century BC drew to a close, Carthage faced its first serious challenge. Greek colonists, spreading westward from their homeland, had established prosperous cities in Sicily and southern Italy. These Greek settlements looked hungrily at the same trade routes that fed Carthaginian prosperity, and conflict was inevitable. The struggle for Sicily would consume Carthaginian energies for centuries, but it would also forge them into a true military power. The transformation was not easy. Unlike the Greeks or Romans, Carthaginians did not glorify warfare as an end in itself. They were merchants and sailors first, soldiers only by necessity. But necessity proved a harsh teacher. Early defeats taught them the importance of professional armies, and they began recruiting mercenaries from across the Mediterranean: Iberian swordsmen, Balearic slingers, Numidian cavalry from North Africa itself. These hired soldiers fought under Carthaginian officers, bound by contract rather than patriotism, but often proving more reliable than citizen militias. The Carthaginian military system that emerged from these conflicts was unique in the ancient world. At its core were small numbers of Carthaginian citizens, usually serving as officers or in elite units like the Sacred Band, a body of nobles' sons who fought with desperate courage to prove their worth. But the bulk of every army consisted of mercenaries, professional soldiers who served for pay and the promise of loot. This system had advantages. Carthaginian casualties remained low, and the army could draw on the specialized skills of warriors from many lands. But it also created dependencies and vulnerabilities that would prove costly in the centuries ahead. Meanwhile, Across the narrow waters that separated Africa from Europe, another power was stirring. Rome, still a modest city-state on the banks of the Tiber River, was beginning its long march toward dominance over the Italian peninsula. In 509 BC, the year that Roman tradition marks as the founding of their republic, Rome and Carthage signed their first treaty. It was a modest agreement, defining spheres of influence and promising mutual respect for each other's trading rights. Neither side could have imagined that this diplomatic courtesy would be the first chapter in a struggle that would end with one city's complete annihilation. The treaty reveals how the two powers saw themselves at the time. Rome was still a regional player, concerned mainly with its immediate neighbors in central Italy. Carthage, by contrast, was already thinking on a Mediterranean scale, claiming authority over much of the North African coast and asserting special rights in Sicily and Sardinia. The document reads like an acknowledgement between unequal partners, Rome promising not to interfere with Carthaginian interests in exchange for trading privileges in Carthaginian ports. But Rome was growing. With each passing decade, Roman legions extended their control further down the Italian peninsula, absorbing or conquering the Greek cities of the south, the Etruscan city-states of the north, and the tribal peoples of the central mountains. They were learning the arts of warfare and diplomacy, forging the military system that would eventually conquer the known world. Most importantly, they were developing the particular Roman genius for organization, the ability to absorb defeated enemies as allies and turn conquest into lasting political unity. Carthage, meanwhile, was reaching the natural limits of its commercial empire. By the 4th century BC, Carthaginian ships traded in every port of the western Mediterranean. Their colonies dotted the coasts of Spain and North Africa, and their wealth was legendary throughout the ancient world. The city itself had grown magnificent, its white walls gleaming in the African sun, its harbours filled with ships from every corner of the known world. Visitors marvelled at the splendour of its temples, the sophistication of its craftsmen, and the cosmopolitan bustle of its markets where a dozen languages mingled with the cries of merchants and the bleating of sacrificial animals. Yet beneath this prosperity lay sources of future weakness. Carthage's empire was held together by mutual interest rather than deep loyalty. Its armies were composed of mercenaries who might defect if pay was late or victory uncertain. Its political system, dominated by wealthy families, sometimes struggled to make quick decisions in times of crisis. Most fundamentally, Carthage remained a maritime power in an age when the future belonged to those who could control land as well as sea. The city's religious practices, meanwhile, were beginning to attract criticism from Greek and Roman observers. The worship of Moloch, though scholars debate whether this was a god or simply a type of sacrifice, involved the burning of children in times of crisis, their charred remains buried in sacred precincts called tophets. These practices, horrifying to Greek and Roman sensibilities, would later provide convenient propaganda for Carthage's enemies. Whether they represented genuine religious devotion or desperate attempts to appease angry gods in times of military disaster remains a matter of scholarly debate. As the 4th century BC ended, Carthage stood at the height of its early power. Its ships commanded the western Mediterranean. Its colonies stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of Greek territory, and its wealth was unmatched outside of the great kingdoms of the East. The city had survived Greek challenges in Sicily, weathered internal political conflicts, and emerged stronger from each trial. Yet the greatest test lay ahead. Across the narrow waters that separated Africa from Europe, Rome was completing its conquest of Italy and turning hungry eyes towards Sicily. The island that had been contested between Carthaginians and Greeks for centuries was about to become the prize in a much larger game. The two greatest powers of the Western Mediterranean, allies in theory but rivals in practice, were about to discover that the world was not large enough for both their ambitions. The stage was set for a conflict that would reshape the ancient world, a struggle between two fundamentally different visions of empire. Rome, with its citizen soldiers and territorial conquests, represented the land-based power of the future. Carthage, with its merchant princes and maritime empire, embodied the commercial civilization of the past. The question was not whether they would fight, but which vision would survive the coming storm. By the 6th century BC, the Phoenician colony had transformed from a desperate refuge into the beating heart of a maritime empire that stretched across the western inner sea like a vast web of trade and influence. What had begun as scattered trading posts and temporary harbours had evolved into a network of colonies, protectorates, and client states that acknowledged the supremacy of the harbour city. The expansion was methodical, driven by commercial logic rather than martial ambition. Each new settlement served a purpose in the greater design. Utica and Hadrumetum secured the coastal approaches, while Ibiza and New Carthage, Cartagena, commanded the routes to Iberian silver mines. The Balearic Islands became a source of skilled slingers, whose bronze bullets could punch through armor at remarkable distances. Sardinia and Corsica provided strategic bases and agricultural surplus, their mountainous interiors yielding timber for the ever-growing fleet. But it was in Iberia that Carthaginian ambitions found their greatest expression. The peninsula's mineral wealth was legendary: silver from Tartessos, copper from the southern mountains, iron from the northern ranges. Phoenician traders had been working these deposits for generations. But now the North African power began establishing permanent footholds. Gadir, modern Cadiz, became the western anchor of their empire, its massive temple to Melkart, serving both as a religious center and a fortress commanding the Atlantic approaches. The wealth that flowed from these enterprises was staggering. Ancient sources speak of silver mines so productive that the very anchors of vessels were cast from precious metal, while lead ingots stamped with their seals have been found across the maritime world. The city's merchants developed sophisticated banking practices, extending credit across vast distances and managing complex transactions that spanned multiple ports and currencies. Letters of credit issued in North Africa could be honored in settlements as distant as the Atlantic coast of Morocco or the Tin Islands of the far north. This commercial empire required new forms of governance, and the oligarchy proved remarkably adaptable. Rather than imposing direct rule on distant territories, they developed a system of treaties and alliances that acknowledged local autonomy while securing exclusive trading rights. Client kings ruled in their ancestral manner, but their external relations were guided by Carthage. Tribute flowed in many forms: precious metals, agricultural products, exotic animals for arena games, and above all, manpower for the armies that protected this far-flung network. The political structure that emerged to manage this complexity was unique in the ancient world. The suffets remained the nominal heads of state, but real power lay with the Council of Elders and the mysterious tribunal known as the 104. This body, drawn from the wealthiest families, served as both Supreme Court and Board of Directors for what was essentially a commercial state. They reviewed the performance of generals, approved major trading ventures, and made the life and death decisions that shaped policy across two continents. The 104 were feared throughout the Carthaginian dominions. Generals who failed in their campaigns might face crucifixion, while those who succeeded too well risked exile for threatening the oligarchy's power. This system produced cautious, competent leadership, but also bred the factionalism that would later prove so damaging. The merchant aristocracy was united in their desire for profit, but divided in their vision of how that profit should be pursued. Naval technology reached new heights under their innovation. The circular harbour could shelter over 200 warships, each vessel a masterpiece of maritime engineering. The standard trireme carried 170 rowers arranged in 3 banks, their bronze rams capable of punching through enemy hulls with devastating effect. But the engineers went further, developing quinqueremes and even larger vessels that mounted catapults and served as floating fortresses. More importantly, they perfected the art of naval warfare itself. Carthaginian admirals developed tactics that exploited their superior seamanship. The famous Periplus maneuver that allowed a skilled captain to circle behind enemy formations, ramming them from unexpected angles. Their navigators could find their way by stars and currents alone, sailing in weather conditions that kept other fleets in port. The sacred texts that guided these voyages were jealously guarded secrets, passed down through families of master mariners who formed a hereditary caste within their society. Yet this very success brought new challenges. As the 6th century progressed, Hellenic colonists were spreading westward with increasing boldness, establishing prosperous settlements on the island and in southern Italy. These new arrivals looked hungrily at the same trade routes that fed Carthaginian prosperity, and they brought with them a very different conception of empire, one based on territorial control rather than commercial networks. The clash was inevitable, and the great island became its focal point. Its position at the center of the inner sea made it strategically vital, while its fertile plains and prosperous cities offered rich prizes for any power that could control them. The eastern half was already dominated by Hellenic settlements like Syracuse and Acragas, whose wealth rivaled that of the motherland cities. The western end remained under Phoenician influence, anchored by strongholds like Motia and Panormus. The first serious collision came in 480 BC, when a massive expedition crossed from Africa with the goal of breaking Greek power once and for all. The force was commanded by Hamilcar, the first of that name to achieve prominence in their annals, and it represented the largest armed effort the maritime hub had yet undertaken. Contemporary sources speak of 300,000 men, though such numbers are surely exaggerated. What cannot be disputed is the scale of the disaster that followed. At Himera, on the northern coast, Hamilcar's army met the combined forces of Syracuse and Acragas in a battle that would reshape the balance of power in the western inner sea. The details remain murky, shrouded in the partisan accounts of later historians, but the outcome was clear. The expedition was destroyed, Hamilcar himself perished in the flames of his own camp, and North African dreams of dominance died with him. The defeat at Himera taught harsh lessons that the leadership would not forget. Pure reliance on hired soldiers, however numerous, could not match the motivated resistance of settlers fighting for their adopted homes. The complex logistics of maintaining large armies across water made ambitious campaigns extraordinarily vulnerable to disruption. Most importantly, the city-state militias of the Hellenic settlements, fighting on familiar ground with local support, possessed advantages that no amount of wealth could easily overcome. The response was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than launching immediate revenge expeditions, Carthage turned inward, consolidating its existing possessions and developing new sources of martial strength. The defeat had been costly in both men and prestige, but the underlying commercial network remained intact. Silver still flowed from Iberian mines. Agricultural products still arrived from Sardinian estates, and the great harbour still welcomed merchants from across the known region. More importantly, the setback forced a revolution in warfare. The old system of loosely organized tribal levies and hired Greek mercenaries gave way to a more professional approach. Officers began studying the tactics that had defeated them, adapting Hellenic phalanx formations to work with North African troops. They recruited more systematically, seeking not just numbers, but specific martial skills. Balearic slingers, whose accuracy was legendary, Numidian horsemen who could ride rings around heavy infantry, Iberian swordsmen whose weapons were feared throughout the maritime world. The religious implications of Himera were equally profound. The defeat was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, leading to an intensification of ritual practices that would later horrify foreign observers. The Tophet, the sacred precinct where children were sacrificed to Moloch in times of crisis, saw increased activity as desperate families sought to appease angry gods. These burnt offerings, their charred remains carefully buried in special urns, became more frequent during emergencies, creating an archaeological record that still disturbs modern excavators. Yet the harbour city proved remarkably resilient. By the middle of the 5th century, their forces were again active on the island, though now following a more cautious strategy. Instead of seeking decisive battles, they focused on fortifying their existing bases and gradually extending their influence through diplomacy and economic pressure. The great fortress of Motia, situated on an island off the western coast, became the symbol of this new approach. Impregnable, well supplied, and connected to the mainland by a causeway that could be broken in times of siege. The rivalry with Syracuse dominated this period, as both powers maneuvered for advantage without committing to all-out war. Syracuse, under the tyranny of Dionysius I, was expanding its own influence throughout the island and southern Italy, creating a counter-network of alliances and dependencies that mirrored Carthaginian practices. Both cities understood that Trinacria was too valuable to abandon, but too large for either to control completely. The result was a series of limited conflicts, diplomatic negotiations, and shifting alliances that kept the region in constant tension. Dionysius proved a formidable opponent, combining innovation in warfare with political cunning. His engineers developed new siege technologies, including massive catapults that could breach the strongest fortifications. His diplomacy extended Syracusan influence as far as the Adriatic, while his fleets challenged Phoenician naval supremacy in waters that had previously been a North African lake. Most dangerously, he understood how to use Carthaginian weaknesses against them, exploiting the cultural divisions within their diverse armies and the political tensions within their oligarchic system. The struggle reached its climax in the siege of Motia in 397 BC. Dionysius had spent years preparing for this assault, building the largest siege train yet seen in the western Inner Sea. When the attack finally came, it represented a test not just of engineering, but of the two competing visions of power. Could the system of fortified bases and hired soldiers withstand the focused assault of a unified city-state? The answer was devastating. Despite heroic resistance, Motia fell after a siege that demonstrated the changing nature of warfare. The old reliance on naval superiority and commercial leverage was no longer enough when faced with enemies who possessed both the technology and the will to assault seemingly impregnable positions. The destruction of Motia sent shockwaves throughout the empire, calling into question the basic assumptions that had guided strategy for generations. Yet even in defeat, the response demonstrated the adaptability that had built their empire. Rather than attempting to rebuild Motia, they established a new base at Lilybaeum, designed from the ground up to resist the kind of assault that had destroyed its predecessor. They recruited new armies, negotiated fresh alliances with native peoples, and prepared for the long struggle that now seemed inevitable. As the 4th century progressed, the pattern of warfare settled into a rhythm of advance and retreat, victory and defeat, that exhausted both sides without producing decisive results. Each campaign brought innovations, new weapons, new tactics, new alliances, but the fundamental balance remained unchanged. The Hellenic settlements controlled the east, the Carthaginian strongholds anchored the west, and the center remained a contested battleground where neither side could establish lasting dominance. This grinding conflict was transforming both civilizations. Syracuse was becoming more warlike, its democracy giving way to tyrants who promised victory at any cost. The maritime hub was learning the harsh necessities of sustained warfare, developing the institutions and strategic thinking that would later challenge the rising power of Latium itself. Neither city could have imagined that their rivalry was merely the overture to a much larger drama that would reshape the entire ancient world. By the dawn of the 3rd century BC, the empire had reached a mature stability that masked growing internal tensions. The commercial networks remained profitable, the naval bases were stronger than ever, and the armed forces had adapted to new realities. But the easy victories of the early expansion were over, replaced by the grinding necessities of defending far-flung territories against increasingly sophisticated enemies. More ominously, a new power was rising across the narrow waters that separated Africa from Europe. The Latin Republic was completing its conquest of Italy, absorbing or destroying every rival from the Alps to the toe of the peninsula. Soon, very soon, the two greatest powers of the Western Inner Sea would find themselves face to face, with the great island once again serving as the prize that would determine the fate of empires. While the harbour city's galleys commanded the western waters and Phoenician merchants counted their silver in African counting houses, a very different kind of power was stirring on the Italian peninsula. The city on the Tiber had begun as little more than a collection of hilltop villages, but by the 4th century before Christ, it had transformed into something unprecedented. A republic that devoured its neighbours not through commerce or maritime dominance, but through an inexorable system of conquest, alliance, and assimilation. Roman expansion was methodical and brutal, unlike the approach of establishing coastal trading posts and negotiating with local rulers. This emerging force absorbed entire peoples into its growing federation. Defeated enemies became allies. Their warriors marched under eagle standards, and their gods found places in an ever-expanding pantheon. This was not empire in the traditional sense. It was something new, a political organism that grew stronger with each conquest rather than more fragmented. By the 3rd century's opening decades, this relentless advance had brought the Italian Republic to the very doorstep of Punic interests. The heel and toe of the peninsula had fallen under control, while the great harbour cities of the south, Tarentum, Rhegium, Neapolis, found themselves either conquered or cowed into submission. Most ominously for the North African power, hungry eyes were turning toward Trinacria, that fertile prize that lay tantalizingly close across the narrow strait. The spark that ignited the first great conflict between these rival civilizations came from an unlikely source. A band of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines, the Sons of Mars. These soldiers of fortune had seized the prosperous city of Messana, controlling the crucial strait between the mainland and Trinacria. When Syracuse moved to dislodge them, The desperate mercenaries made a fateful decision. They appealed for help to both Carthage and Rome simultaneously. The Phoenicians responded first, their vessels swift to cross from their bases on the western coast. A garrison took control of Messana's citadel, and it seemed the crisis would be resolved in the traditional manner, through negotiation, bribery, and the careful balancing of interests that had kept the western waters relatively peaceful for generations. The harbour city's merchants could return to their ledgers, confident that their maritime supremacy remained unchallenged. But the senators in Rome saw the situation differently. For them, Punic control of Messana represented an intolerable threat to their newly won dominance in southern Italy. If the Phoenicians could garrison cities just across the water, what was to stop them from supporting rebellions among the recently conquered Greek settlements? The debate in the Senate was fierce, with traditionalists arguing that crossing the water would violate ancient agreements and drag the Republic into conflicts far from home. The decision, when it came, revealed the fundamental difference between the two powers. Where policy was made by merchant princes calculating profit and loss, Roman choices emerged from a citizen assembly that prized honor above commercial advantage. The vote was close, but those favoring action prevailed. Consul Appius Claudius would cross the strait with 2 legions, and the age of Phoenician supremacy would face its first serious challenge. The initial crossing was a masterstroke of audacity. Claudius negotiated secretly with the Mamertines still inside Messana, promising them better terms than their current protectors could offer. When his forces approached under cover of darkness, the mercenaries opened the gates and expelled their garrison. By dawn, eagles flew over the citadel, and the die was cast for a struggle that would reshape the ancient world. The response was swift but predictable. Admiral Hanno brought a powerful armada to reclaim Messana, while land forces under Hiero of Syracuse prepared to besiege the upstart invaders. It should have been a simple matter. The legions had no experience with maritime operations, no galleys to speak of, and no way to supply themselves across hostile waters. The merchants of the harbour city expected a brief campaign that would restore the traditional balance and teach the land-bound Latins the folly of challenging those who ruled the sea. Instead, they discovered that their enemies possessed something more dangerous than ships or silver, an absolute refusal to accept defeat. When Claudius found himself trapped in Messana with dwindling supplies, he did not negotiate or retreat. Instead, he launched desperate attacks against both the Phoenician squadron and the Syracusan army, using the superior discipline and equipment of his legions to achieve victories that seemed impossible given the strategic situation. The capture of Syracuse itself sent shockwaves through the Punic establishment. Hiero, faced with the choice between destruction and accommodation, chose survival and brought his considerable forces over to the Roman side. Within months, the invaders had transformed from isolated raiders into the dominant power on the eastern half of Trinacria, their supply lines secured by new allies, and their confidence boosted by victories against supposedly superior enemies. The hostilities that followed would consume 23 years and transform both civilizations in ways neither could have anticipated. For the North African power, it meant abandoning the comfortable sphere of commercial competition and proxy conflicts in favor of total struggle against an enemy that seemed incapable of understanding when it was beaten. For the Italian Republic, it meant learning to fight on the sea against masters who had ruled those waters for centuries. The early campaigns revealed the fundamental strengths and weaknesses of both systems. Armies from the harbour city were professional, well-equipped, and led by experienced officers who understood the complexities of combined operations. Their squadrons were magnificent, their tactics sophisticated, and their ability to move forces by sea gave them strategic flexibility that land-bound enemies could not match. But their soldiers fought for pay rather than patriotism. Their commanders were subject to political interference from merchant oligarchs who understood profit better than strategy, and their empire was held together by mutual interest rather than shared identity. The Roman forces, by contrast, were citizen soldiers fighting for their homes and their honor. Their equipment was standardized, their discipline legendary, and their willingness to absorb casualties and continue fighting are bordered on the fanatical. But they were essentially a land army trying to fight a maritime campaign, dependent on allies for vessels and supplies, vulnerable to the kind of strategic mobility that Phoenician admirals provided their enemies. The early encounters at sea were disasters for the Republic. At Lipara, an entire squadron was captured through superior seamanship, while other engagements saw inexperienced crews outmaneuvered and outfought by professionals. It became clear that traditional tactics, ramming and boarding actions fought by skilled mariners, would never allow the land-based power to compete with centuries of expertise. The solution, when it came, epitomized the Roman genius for practical innovation. Unable to match Phoenician seamanship, they decided to turn maritime battles into land battles fought on floating platforms. The corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto enemy vessels, transformed their galleys into mobile fortresses from which legionaries could assault hostile ships using the same tactics that had conquered Italy. The first major test of this new technology came at Mylae, where Consul Duilius led a Roman armada against the Admiral Hannibal, not the famous general, but an earlier bearer of that name. The Phoenicians approached with confidence, expecting another easy victory over inexperienced crews. Instead, they found their superior seamanship neutralized by a forest of boarding bridges that locked their galleys in place and allowed marines to swarm aboard. The victory at Mylae stunned both sides. For the first time in centuries, a Punic squadron had been decisively defeated in open battle. The captured vessels were paraded through the streets of Rome, while Duilius became the first commander to celebrate a triumph. More importantly, the Republic had demonstrated that maritime supremacy was not a law of nature, but a temporary advantage that could be overcome through determination and innovation. The response revealed both the strengths and limitations of the Phoenician system. Rather than accepting a new balance of power, they committed massive resources to a counteroffensive designed to end the conflict through a direct assault on Italy itself. The expedition of Marcus Atilius Regulus represented everything the harbour city could bring to bear: an armada of over 300 vessels, veteran crews commanded by experienced admirals, and a strategy that sought to exploit their traditional advantages in mobility and logistics. The Battle of Ecnomus, fought off the southern coast of Trinacria, became the largest engagement in ancient history. Nearly 700 galleys clashed in waters that turned red with blood, while tens of thousands of rowers and marines fought for control of the sea lanes that would determine the outcome. The Roman squadron, arranged in the wedge formation that had served their armies so well on land, drove through the center and won a victory that opened the way to Africa itself. Regulus landed on the North African coast with 15,000 men, and immediately began ravaging the fertile hinterland that supplied the harbour city with grain and recruits. For a moment, it seemed the hostilities might end with Phoenician submission, as their armies proved unable to match Roman discipline in open battle. Towns surrendered, tribal allies defected, and panic gripped the ruling oligarchy as enemy eagles appeared within sight of their capital's walls. But the merchants possessed one crucial advantage that their enemies had not anticipated: the wealth to hire the finest expertise available anywhere in the ancient world. The arrival of Xanthippus the Spartan, a professional soldier trained in the legendary traditions of Lacedaemon, transformed the strategic situation almost overnight. Xanthippus brought with him not just tactical knowledge, but a clear understanding of how to exploit the weaknesses inherent in the Roman system. The Republic's armies were magnificent when fighting on familiar ground with secure supply lines, but they became vulnerable when isolated in hostile territory against enemies who understood their limitations. The Spartan reorganized the forces, trained them in new formations, and prepared for a confrontation that would test whether citizen soldiers could maintain their superiority when stripped of their natural advantages. The Battle of Tunis became a masterclass in the effective use of combined arms against an enemy who had grown overconfident in their previous successes. Xanthippus deployed his elephants to break up the formations, used his cavalry to prevent their traditional tactical flexibility, and committed his infantry only when the enemy was already disrupted and demoralized. Regulus was captured, his army destroyed, and the survivors evacuated by a relief squadron that barely escaped the harbour city's resurgent forces. The disaster in Africa forced both sides to reconsider their strategies and commit to a longer, more grinding struggle than either had initially anticipated. For Rome, it meant abandoning dreams of quick victory and settling in for the kind of attritional campaign that their political system was uniquely equipped to sustain. For the Phoenicians, it demonstrated that defensive victories, however spectacular, could not solve the fundamental problem of an enemy who refused to acknowledge defeat. The middle years became a dreary succession of raids, sieges, and inconclusive battles that drained both treasuries without producing decisive results. Punic squadrons controlled the sea but could not prevent Roman armies from dominating the land. The Republic's legions could win engagements but could not force a peace with enemies who could always retreat to their fortresses and African bases. Trinacria itself became a wasteland, its cities reduced to rubble, and its countryside depopulated by years of constant fighting. Both civilizations were learning harsh lessons about the costs of total struggle between evenly matched opponents. The harbour city discovered that their mercenary system, however professional, could not match the sustained commitment of citizen soldiers fighting for their own survival. The merchants who controlled policy found their careful calculations disrupted by commanders who preferred honor to profit, and enemies who seemed willing to bankrupt themselves rather than accept reasonable terms. The Italian Republic, meanwhile, was discovering that their talent for absorbing and assimilating defeated enemies did not translate to maritime operations against a sophisticated empire. Their armadas, despite tactical innovations, remained vulnerable to storms and superior seamanship. More importantly, they were learning that victories on land meant nothing if they could not be translated into political control over an enemy whose real strength lay beyond their reach. The final phase began when both sides, exhausted by years of inconclusive fighting, committed their remaining resources to one last campaign that would determine the outcome. The effort centered on a massive build-up designed to regain absolute control of the sea and isolate Roman forces on Trinacria. The Republic's response was characteristically direct. They would build their own armada, larger and more powerful than anything previously attempted, and settle the question through direct confrontation. The Aegates, lying off the western coast, became the setting for this final test of maritime supremacy. Admiral Hanno approached with vessels loaded with supplies for the besieged fortress of Lilybaeum, while the Roman commander, Lutatius Catulus, waited with over 200 galleys of the latest design. The engagement that followed was not just a clash of squadrons, but a confrontation between two different conceptions of power itself. The result was a catastrophe that ended not just the battle, but the entire conflict. Hanno's armada was destroyed, the supplies that might have sustained further resistance were lost, and the harbour city's ability to continue the struggle was broken. Hamilcar Barca, the commander on Trinacria, found himself with veteran troops but no way to supply them, facing enemies who could now be reinforced at will. The peace negotiations that followed revealed how completely the balance of power had shifted. The terms imposed were harsh: evacuation of Trinacria, payment of massive indemnities, and acceptance of limitations that acknowledged the Republic's new status as a maritime power. More importantly, the hostilities had established precedents and created animosities that would shape the relationship between these civilizations for generations to come. As Hamilcar's veterans filed onto their transport ships, evacuating territories their people had held for centuries, few could have imagined that this was merely the first act in a drama that would consume both civilizations. The seeds of future conflict had been sown in the blood-soaked soil of Trinacria, while in the mountains of Iberia, a young boy named Hannibal was learning to hate everything the eagles represented. The first struggle was over, but the greater confrontation was yet to begin. The humiliation of defeat burned like acid in the soul of Hamilcar Barca. As his transport vessels limped away from the shores of Trinacria, carrying the remnants of forces that had once commanded the western waters, the general made a vow that would echo through history. The first struggle with the Italian Republic was over, but the reckoning had only begun. In the mountains of Iberia, far from the merchant princes who had failed their soldiers, Hamilcar would forge a new kind of power, one built not on commercial calculation, but on the white-hot flame of vengeance. The years following the peace settlement revealed the profound differences between victor and vanquished. The city on the Tiber celebrated its triumph with public festivals and magnificent temples, the captured galleys decorating the forum as monuments to citizen virtue. Roman confidence soared as tribute silver flowed in from across the sea, funding new roads, aqueducts, and the ever-expanding apparatus of conquest. For the first time, eagles had proven themselves masters of the waves, and the world seemed to shrink before their advance. The harbour city, by contrast, writhed in the agony of catastrophe and political upheaval. The massive indemnities imposed by the peace treaty drained the treasury, while the loss of Trinacria shattered the commercial networks that had sustained prosperity for centuries. Worse yet, the mercenary soldiers who had served faithfully in the recent campaign now demanded payment that an empty treasury could not provide. The result was a rebellion that would make the defeat by the Republic seem mild by comparison. The mercenary uprising began in the spring following the evacuation, when African and Iberian soldiers camped outside the city walls, realized their masters could not honor their contracts. What started as a protest over unpaid wages quickly escalated into something far more dangerous: a social revolution that threatened to tear apart the very foundations of Carthaginian civilization. The rebels were joined by oppressed Libyan farmers, exploited mine workers, and tribal chieftains who had long chafed under Tyrian rule. For 3 years, the port city fought for its life against enemies who knew its weaknesses intimately. The rebels controlled the countryside, cutting off food supplies and recruiting reinforcements from among the dispossessed peoples of North Africa. They possessed inside knowledge of defensive preparations, understood the political divisions within the oligarchy, and fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. At times, the besiegers came so close that smoke from their campfires could be seen from the walls. Hamilcar emerged from this crucible transformed. The commercial aristocrat who had sailed to Trinacria became something altogether more dangerous. A soldier politician who understood that tactical genius meant nothing without the political will to sustain it. He crushed the rebellion through a combination of battlefield brilliance and ruthless pragmatism, dividing his enemies against each other and exploiting their internal contradictions. But the experience taught him that the harbour city's traditional methods were inadequate for the struggles ahead. While the oligarchy celebrated the restoration of order and returned to their counting houses, Hamilcar was already planning for the next phase of the Great Confrontation. The peace treaty forbade direct revenge against the Republic, but it said nothing about expansion in the peninsula. The region's mineral wealth could fund new forces, its warrior tribes could provide loyal soldiers, and its mountains could serve as training grounds for a generation of officers who would learn to hate everything the Eagles represented. The crossing to the peninsula marked the beginning of a new chapter in North African history. Hamilcar brought with him not just soldiers and administrators, but his family, including a 9-year-old boy named Hannibal, who would soon swear an oath that would reshape the ancient world. At a blood-soaked altar in the mountains, with sacred fires burning and priests chanting in the old tongue, the child placed his hand on the sacrifice and promised eternal enmity to the Republic. It was theatre, but it was also something more. The birth of a legend that would haunt nightmares for generations. The reconquest of the peninsula proceeded with methodical efficiency. Unlike the scattered commercial outposts of earlier centuries, Hamilcar established a territorial empire based on direct control and occupation. Silver financed professional forces, while tribal recruits learned discipline and tactics. New cities rose where once there had been only trading posts, their walls designed not for commerce, but for siege defense. Most importantly, a new generation of officers emerged from the campaigns, men who understood that the next confrontation would be fought not for commercial advantage, but for survival itself. Hasdrubal the Fair, Hamilcar's son-in-law and successor, brought diplomatic sophistication to the enterprise. Where Hamilcar had relied primarily on conquest, Hasdrubal negotiated treaties and marriage alliances that extended influence through peaceful means. His greatest achievement was the Ebro Treaty with the Republic, which recognized the river as the boundary between their respective spheres. The agreement seemed to promise peace, but it also gave the port city legal cover for expansion south of the line. Behind the diplomatic facade, however, preparations for the ultimate confrontation continued. Workshops produced weapons and armor according to standardized patterns, while training camps in the mountains forged recruits from 12 different peoples into cohesive units. The famous mixed arms system reached new levels of sophistication, combining the mobility of Numidian cavalry with the staying power of infantry and the shock effect of African elephants. The political situation within the harbour city itself was evolving in ways that would prove crucial for the coming struggle. The humiliation of the first defeat had discredited the old commercial leadership, while the success of the venture elevated Hamilcar's faction, the Barcids, to unprecedented influence. This was not merely a shift in personnel, but a fundamental change in the nature of power. The merchant oligarchy found itself increasingly dependent on commanders who owed their loyalty to family honor rather than commercial calculation. Young Hannibal came of age in this transformed world. Unlike his father, who had learned generalship through bitter experience, the future commander was raised from childhood to be a weapon of vengeance. He spoke Latin as fluently as his native tongue, studied tactics and history, and learned to think like his enemies, while nurturing an implacable hatred for everything they represented. By his 20th year, He was already recognized as the most promising officer in the peninsula, combining his father's strategic vision with a tactical genius that seemed almost supernatural. The spark that would ignite the second great confrontation came from the most unlikely of sources, a minor town called Saguntum. The settlement lay south of the Ebro, but maintained ties to the Republic that dated back to the previous century. When local political disputes escalated into violence, both sides appealed to their respective patrons, creating exactly the kind of proxy conflict that had triggered the earlier struggle over Trinacria. Ambassadors arrived in the capital of New Carthage with demands that Hannibal respect Saguntum's independence. The young general, now supreme commander, following Hasdrubal's assassination, received them with the courtesy due to distinguished visitors and the contempt reserved for representatives of a despised enemy. The interview was brief and decisive. Saguntum lay within the sphere as defined by treaty. Its internal affairs were no concern of the Republic. The matter was closed. The siege that followed was both an operation and a diplomatic statement. Hannibal's engineers employed the most advanced techniques available, while his host demonstrated the coordinated effectiveness that training had produced. But the real audience was not the defenders of Saguntum, but the watching powers of the Mediterranean. After 8 months of exemplary siegecraft, the town fell, its population enslaved, and its wealth added to the treasury. The response from the Republic was swift and predictable. Ambassadors crossed to Africa with an ultimatum: surrender Hannibal for trial or face the consequences. The reception they received in the council chamber epitomized the transformation that had occurred since the previous struggle. Where once the oligarchy might have calculated costs and benefits, seeking accommodation through negotiation, the new leadership embraced confrontation with something approaching relief. The pretense of peace was over. The real struggle could finally begin. The declaration that followed formalized what both sides had long acknowledged. The first contest had settled nothing, merely establishing the conditions under which the true test of strength would be conducted. This time, there would be no commercial considerations, no diplomatic escape routes, no halfway measures. One civilization would emerge supreme, the other would be destroyed. The stakes could not have been higher. But Hannibal had no intention of fighting the kind of defensive campaign that had served his enemies so well in the previous struggle. While generals planned their strategy around the assumption that he would await their assault from his strongholds, the young commander was already implementing one of the most audacious plans in history. If the Republic expected him to remain on the defensive, he would instead carry the conflict to their very doorstep. The preparations for what would become known as the March to Italy were staggering in their scope and complexity. A host of nearly 90,000 men had to be assembled from dozens of different peoples, each with their own languages, customs, and traditions. Supply trains were organized for a journey whose route remained secret, even from most of the commanders involved. Most remarkably, 37 African elephants were trained for mountain warfare in conditions unlike anything they had previously experienced. The departure from New Carthage in the spring represented the culmination of 20 years of preparation and the beginning of a campaign that would test whether individual genius could triumph over institutional strength. Hannibal's contingent included the finest soldiers the port city could produce: infantry hardened by constant campaigning, Numidian cavalry whose mobility was legendary, African elephants that could break the strongest battle lines, and a corps of officers who shared their commander's vision of total victory. The march through Gaul became an epic of endurance and diplomacy as much as movement. Hannibal negotiated with dozens of tribal chiefs, fought battles against those who could not be bought or persuaded, and maintained the cohesion of his polyglot host through sheer force of personality. Scouts reported his progress, but seemed unable to grasp the true magnitude of what was unfolding. How could any general seriously contemplate crossing the Alps with elephants and heavy equipment? The answer came in the autumn, when advance parties of Numidian cavalry appeared in the Po Valley, like harbingers of divine judgment. The impossible had become reality. Hannibal had brought forces across the mountains that strategists had considered impassable. The elephants were largely dead, victims of altitude and cold, and the host was reduced by half from its original strength. But what remained was the hardest core of professional soldiers in the ancient world, led by a commander whose reputation for invincibility was already spreading through the terrified communities of northern Italy. The psychological impact of the achievement was as important as its significance. The Republic had based its entire strategy on the assumption that any serious threat would come by sea, where their newfound mastery could contain it. The appearance of enemy forces in the heart of Italy, having bypassed every defensive preparation, shattered the complacency that had grown during 2 decades of uninterrupted success. More importantly, Hannibal's presence in Italy offered an alternative to the Pax Romana that had been imposed on the peninsula's diverse peoples. His host included Gauls who had never accepted rule, warriors who had experienced administration, and African soldiers who represented a different model of Mediterranean civilization. The message was clear. Dominance was neither inevitable nor permanent. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of 2 cities, but the future direction of Western civilization. In the harbour city, the oligarchy prepared for a struggle that would test their financial resources and political unity to the breaking point. In the Republic, the Senate girded itself for a type of warfare unlike anything in their previous experience. Not a distant campaign against foreign enemies, but a fight for survival in their own backyard. Winter was coming to the Alps, but the fire of vengeance that had sustained the Barcid family through 20 years of preparation was about to be unleashed upon the world. The greatest genius of the ancient era stood poised to fulfill his childhood oath, while the Republic that had conquered Italy prepared to discover whether citizen virtue could triumph over professional excellence. The second act of the great drama was about to begin. The snow was still melting in the Alpine passes when the Barcid commander struck his first blow against the Italian heartland. At the Trebbia River, swollen with winter floods, he demonstrated the fieldcraft that would make his name synonymous with genius. The consul, Sempronius, eager for glory and confident in the superiority of citizen soldiers, led his legions into a carefully prepared trap. By evening, 20,000 Latins lay dead in the muddy fields, while the Punic host had announced its arrival in Italy with a victory that sent shockwaves through every city from the Alps to Sicily. The psychological impact of Trebbia exceeded even its martial significance. For generations, citizens had grown accustomed to hearing of distant victories won by their eagles in foreign lands. Now, suddenly, enemy campfires burned within sight of Latin hills, while refugees streamed south with tales of African elephants and Iberian swordsmen who seemed to anticipate every move the legions might make. The Republic that had conquered the peninsula found itself fighting for survival in territories it had considered permanently pacified. The Carthaginian general's genius lay not merely in his innovations, remarkable though they were, but in his profound understanding of the political foundations of power. Unlike previous enemies who had challenged the Republic through direct confrontation, the Phoenician commander grasped that Italy was not a monolithic state, but a complex federation held together by mutual interest and carefully calibrated rewards. If he could demonstrate that protection was worthless and vengeance avoidable, the entire system might unravel from within. The campaign that followed Trebia became a masterclass in psychological warfare as much as operational strategy. Instead of advancing directly on the capital, the invader marched his forces through the rich farmlands of Etruria, systematically devastating territories belonging to citizens while leaving allied communities untouched. The message was unmistakable. Those who had supported the Republic would suffer, while those willing to change sides would find a generous new protector. At Lake Trasimene, shrouded in the morning mists that rose from the water, the Bayid leader sprung his most audacious ambush yet. The consul Flaminius, pursuing what he believed to be a retreating enemy, led his entire contingent into a defile where Punic forces waited in perfect concealment. The slaughter that followed was so complete that historians would struggle for centuries to explain how 15,000 legionaries could simply vanish in a single morning. Flaminius himself died in the fighting. His body never recovered from the carnage that stained the lake's waters red. 2 devastating defeats in as many seasons shattered the confident assumptions that had guided strategy since the first Punic victory. The traditional approach of meeting enemies in open combat, relying on superior discipline and equipment to achieve decisive results, had proven worse than useless against a commander who seemed to anticipate every move before it was made. Panic gripped the capital as citizens realized that their supposedly invincible system had encountered something genuinely unprecedented. The appointment of Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator marked a fundamental shift in thinking. Fabius understood what many of his contemporaries refused to acknowledge. The invasion force was a finite resource that could be depleted through attrition, even if it could not be defeated in direct confrontation. The approach that emerged, following the enemy at a distance, harassing his foragers, cutting off stragglers, but avoiding major engagements, earned Fabius the contemptuous nickname Cunctator, the Delayer. But it also began the slow process of wearing down the expeditionary force. The Fabian approach was politically brilliant, but emotionally devastating. For a people raised on stories of glorious conquests and decisive victories, citizens watched helplessly as their countryside burned while their troops shadowed the destroyers like nervous wolves, never closing for the kill. Allied communities began to waver in their loyalty, wondering whether a protector who could not protect was worthy of continued support. The Republic's enemies throughout the Mediterranean took note, calculating whether the moment had come to settle old scores. The Carthaginian general, meanwhile, found himself facing the one challenge his genius could not overcome: time itself. His host remained undefeated, his reputation for invincibility intact. But each passing month brought new problems that no amount of skill could solve. Reinforcements from the harbour city arrived sporadically and in insufficient numbers, while recruitment among Italian allies proceeded more slowly than his grand strategy required. Most critically, the promised support from Philip of Macedon and other Eastern rulers remained frustratingly theoretical. The breaking point came when impatience with Fabian caution led to the appointment of new consuls who promised a return to the aggressive tactics that had built the Republic's empire. Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus took the field with the largest host the city on the Tiber had ever assembled, 86,000 men drawn from every corner of the Confederation. If the Punic commander wanted a decisive engagement, they would give him one that would end his threat forever. The collision at Cannae became the most studied encounter in history, a perfect demonstration of how operational genius could triumph over overwhelming numerical superiority. The invader deployed his forces in a convex formation that invited the attack while concealing the trap that would destroy it. As the legions pressed forward into what seemed like a collapsing center, heavy infantry and cavalry closed around their flanks like the jaws of some monstrous predator. The destruction that followed defied contemporary understanding of what was possible in ancient combat. 50,000 citizens died in a single afternoon, including the consul Paulus, 80 senators, and hundreds of knights whose families had served the state for generations. The survivors who escaped carried with them not just news of defeat, but something far more devastating: the knowledge that supremacy was an illusion that could be shattered by sufficiently skillful enemies. Cannae represented the high watermark of the Italian campaign, but it also revealed the fundamental limitations of the Barcid position. The masterpiece that destroyed a consular force could not solve the deeper problems that plagued his expedition: insufficient reinforcements, limited naval support, and the gradual erosion of his multicultural contingent through combat losses and desertion. Most critically, the great victory failed to achieve its primary political objective: the collapse of the Confederation. The months following Cannae tested the character of both civilizations in ways that pure competition could not. Several major cities defected to the invader, including Capua, whose wealth and position seemed to validate his promise that hegemony could be broken. But the core of the Confederation held firm, bound together by ties that proved stronger than immediate calculations. The Latin allies in particular remained loyal, understanding that their privileged position within the system offered better prospects than uncertain treatment by a foreign conqueror. Resilience in the face of catastrophe demonstrated qualities that their enemies had not anticipated. Rather than seeking terms after Cannae, the Senate freed slaves to fill the depleted legions, borrowed against future revenues to fund continued resistance, and formally refused to ransom the prisoners taken in the engagement. The message was unmistakable. The Republic would continue fighting regardless of cost, and any who joined the invader could expect no mercy when vengeance finally came. The conflict's character began to shift as both sides adapted to realities that their initial approaches had not anticipated. The Carthaginian general found himself increasingly tied to the defense of allied cities that lacked the resources to sustain themselves against siegecraft. His mobile striking force gradually transformed into a collection of scattered garrisons, each vulnerable to the kind of attritional warfare at which engineering excelled. The genius, who had destroyed legions in open combat, now found himself reduced to defensive operations that negated his greatest advantages. The response evolved in directions that would have profound implications for the Republic's future development. Unable to defeat the invader directly, they began targeting the broader Punic Empire that sustained his operations. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, emerged as the architect of this new approach. Understanding that victory in Italy required success in Spain, Africa, and wherever else Carthaginian power could be challenged. The Iberian campaign became the crucible in which reforms were tested and perfected. Scipio introduced innovations borrowed directly from the Barcid playbook, while maintaining the disciplinary advantages that remained the legion's greatest strength. His victories at Baecula and Ilipa demonstrated that commanders could learn from their defeats, adapting enemy techniques while preserving their own institutional strengths. The defection of Syphax and the Numidian cavalry that had served Carthage so effectively marked a turning point whose significance extended far beyond immediate considerations. Scipio's diplomatic coup deprived the invader of the mobile striking force that had been essential to his operational system, while providing forces with capabilities they had previously lacked. The psychological impact was equally important. If even Carthage's oldest allies were changing sides, what did that suggest about the ultimate trajectory of the struggle? Meanwhile, in Italy itself, the grinding process of attrition was slowly accomplishing what decisive engagements had not. The expeditionary force remained dangerous, but it was no longer the terrifying host that had crossed the Alps with dreams of destroying power forever. Recruitment among Italian allies had virtually ceased. Reinforcements from Africa arrived irregularly and in insufficient numbers, and the Phoenician commander found himself increasingly isolated in a hostile countryside where every village might harbor enemies. The siege of Syracuse, conducted simultaneously with Scipio's operations, demonstrated the Republic's growing confidence and expanding capabilities. The city's legendary defenses, enhanced by the genius of Archimedes, had been considered impregnable by previous generations. But persistence, engineering skill, and sheer bloody-minded determination eventually prevailed, even though the great mathematician died in the sack that followed. The fall of Syracuse sent a clear message throughout the Mediterranean. No fortress could withstand siegecraft indefinitely. Hasdrubal Barca's march from Iberia represented Carthage's last serious attempt to reinforce his brother and achieve the decisive victory that had seemed so close after Cannae. The younger sibling had rebuilt Punic power in the peninsula after Scipio's victories, recruited a new host from among the warrior tribes, and attempted to replicate the famous Alpine crossing. For a brief moment, it seemed that two Carthaginian contingents might converge on the capital itself, fulfilling the grand strategy that had inspired the original expedition. The disaster at the Metaurus River destroyed these hopes with brutal finality. The consul, Gaius Claudius Nero, demonstrated the kind of operational mobility that forces had learned from their enemies, marching north to reinforce his colleague while leaving the elder Barcid completely unaware of his movement. The encounter itself was less an engagement than an execution, as Hasdrubal's exhausted troops found themselves trapped between two hosts with no avenue of escape. The aftermath of the Metaurus marked the effective end of the Italian adventure, though the great commander would remain in the peninsula for several more years, when his brother's severed head was thrown into his camp by cavalry. The Carthaginian general reportedly said that he recognized the fate of Carthage. The comment was prophetic. Without reinforcement or realistic hope of decisive victory, the invasion force had become a dead end that absorbed resources without advancing Phoenician objectives. Scipio's landing in Africa represented the culmination of strategic evolution throughout the long struggle. The young general who had learned his trade-fighting Punic forces in Iberia now brought the conflict to the enemy's homeland, reversing the geographic situation that had given the invader such advantages in Italy. The contingent that disembarked near Utica was a very different force from the legions that had suffered at Trebia and Cannae, hardened by years of campaigning, led by officers who understood their enemy's methods, and supported by allies whose loyalty had been tested in the crucible of defeat and recovery. The recall of the Barcid commander from Italy to defend his homeland marked one of history's great ironies. The general who had spent 15 years attempting to bring power to its knees now found himself summoned home to prevent the very capital he had fought to protect from suffering the fate he had planned for the Republic. The evacuation of his remaining forces was conducted with the skill that had marked all his operations, but it could not disguise the fundamental reality. The greatest genius of the ancient world had failed to achieve his objectives. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine not merely the outcome of a single conflict, but the future direction of Mediterranean civilization. At Zama, 2 generations of innovation would meet in an encounter that would test whether individual genius could triumph over institutional adaptation. The Punic strategist faced an enemy transformed by 20 years of struggle, while Scipio commanded forces that embodied everything the Republic had learned from its darkest hour. The long conflict was approaching its climax, and with it, the fate of empires hung in the balance. The dust of Zama had barely settled when the true magnitude of defeat became apparent. Scipio's victory had been complete. The Barcid commander's vaunted elephants turned against their own forces, his cavalry scattered, his veterans cut down in their thousands. Hannibal himself had escaped the carnage, but his aura of invincibility lay shattered on the African plain, alongside the dreams of supremacy that had sustained 2 generations of struggle. The negotiations that followed were less a diplomatic exchange than a funeral rite for an empire. The terms dictated by the victorious Republic were designed not merely to end the current hostilities, but to ensure that the North African capital could never again threaten the new order emerging across the Mediterranean. The Phoenician delegation, led by Hannibal himself in a final irony, found themselves compelled to accept conditions that would have been unthinkable just years before. The settlement's provisions struck at every foundation of power. The proud armada that had once ruled the western waters was reduced to a mere 10 craft, barely sufficient for coastal patrol. The elephant corps that had terrorized legions from the Trebia to Cannae was disbanded forever, while the right to wage warfare was circumscribed by clauses requiring permission from the Senate for any martial action beyond Africa's borders. Most crushing of all, an indemnity of 10,000 talents, payable over 50 years, would drain the treasury and ensure perpetual subordination. Yet even as the negotiators signed away their empire's independence, few could have anticipated the remarkable resilience that would characterize the following decades. The Phoenician metropolis, stripped of its martial pretensions and colonial possessions, discovered within itself reserves of mercantile energy that seemed to multiply rather than diminish under the weight of defeat. Like a river redirected by fallen rocks, enterprise found new channels through which to flow. The transformation began almost immediately. Freed from the enormous expense of maintaining fleets and garrisons across 3 continents, merchants could redirect their capital toward purely trade-based ventures. The indemnity payments, crushing though they appeared, were met with a punctuality that astonished observers. Silver flowed from revitalized African mines, agricultural estates were reorganized for maximum efficiency, and new trading networks emerged to replace those lost with the Western territories. Hannibal himself embodied this metamorphosis from warrior to administrator. The general who had once threatened the Italian Republic now turned his genius towards civic reform, applying the same systematic thinking that had characterized his campaigns to the mundane but vital tasks of government. Tax collection was rationalized, public works were funded through innovative financial instruments, and infrastructure was rebuilt along more efficient lines. The port facilities, those engineering marvels that had once sheltered hundreds of warships, were converted to purely mercantile purposes. Where quinqueremes had once prepared for naval combat, merchant shipping now loaded cargoes bound for Alexandria, Rhodes, and even Italy itself. The circular basins that had symbolized supremacy became monuments to adaptation, their stone quays echoing with the shouts of traders rather than the clash of bronze. Agriculture throughout the African territories experienced a similar renaissance. The estates that had once supplied provisions for distant garrisons were reorganized to serve Mediterranean markets hungry for exotic products. Olive oil from the interior hills competed with the finest Greek varieties, while African wine began appearing on tables from Spain to Syria. Even the elephant breeding grounds were converted to more practical purposes, their former inhabitants replaced by cattle and horses destined for foreign buyers. The population, swollen by refugees from lost territories, but no longer drained by military conscription, threw itself into these endeavors, with an energy that bordered on the frenetic. Workshops that had once produced weapons and armor now crafted luxury goods sought after throughout the known world. Phoenician purple dye, that ancient symbol of maritime wealth, commanded higher prices than ever as demand outstripped supply in an increasingly prosperous Mediterranean economy. This fiscal revival was all the more remarkable for occurring under the watchful eyes of suspicious neighbors. The Berber kingdoms that bordered Tyrian territory had emerged from the recent conflict as allies of the victorious Republic, their cavalry having proven instrumental in the decisive encounter at Zama. King Massinissa, in particular, had been rewarded with territorial grants that brought his domains to the very gates of the port city, creating a permanent threat that diplomacy had to navigate with exquisite care. The relationship with these rulers became a constant source of friction that would ultimately prove fatal to independence. The Numidian king, emboldened by his alliance with the Italian Republic and confident in his military superiority, began a systematic campaign of territorial aggrandizement that nibbled away at possessions like a persistent tide eroding a shoreline. Border raids escalated into permanent occupations, while diplomatic protests to the arbiters in distant Italy met with responses that ranged from indifferent to openly hostile. The fundamental problem lay in the covenant's deliberately ambiguous language regarding territorial boundaries. Where earlier agreements had specified precise geographic limits, the post-Zama stipulations relied on vague formulations that could be interpreted to suit the convenience of the stronger party. When Berber cavalry occupied fertile districts that had fed the metropolis for generations, appeals for justice found themselves entangled in legal technicalities that favored the accusers rather than the victims. More insidious still was the psychological warfare that accompanied these territorial encroachments. The African allies' agents spread rumors throughout the Mediterranean that prosperity masked preparations for renewed military adventure. Every successful venture was portrayed as evidence of hidden martial ambitions, while punctual payment of indemnities was twisted into proof that secret treasures remained available for future warfare. The Republic's response to these accusations revealed the deep suspicion with which they viewed their former enemy's recovery. Despite overwhelming evidence of compliance with obligations, influential voices in the Senate began questioning whether such rapid revival was compatible with genuine submission. The very success of adaptation became grounds for renewed hostility, as though prosperity itself were a form of rebellion against the imposed order. Marcus Porcius Cato emerged as the most vocal advocate of this increasingly paranoid perspective. The elder statesman, whose political career had been built on appeals to traditional values and suspicion of foreign influence, found in the resurgence a perfect target for his rhetorical talents. His visits to Africa, ostensibly diplomatic missions aimed at resolving border disputes, became intelligence-gathering expeditions that fed his growing conviction that the armistice was merely an interlude between wars. Cato's famous declaration, "Carthage must be destroyed," became more than a political slogan, devolved into an obsession that colored every aspect of his public career. In speech after speech, he painted lurid pictures of merchants accumulating wealth that could only serve martial purposes, of port facilities that could be converted overnight to naval bases, of a population that had merely exchanged military service for financial cunning, while retaining its fundamental hostility to the new order. The irony was lost on few observers that the very qualities the Republic had once celebrated in itself Enterprise, civic virtue, resilience in the face of adversity were now cited as evidence of perfidy. The metropolis that had rebuilt itself through means, that had met every obligation with scrupulous exactness, that had transformed itself from a martial threat into a model of success, found these very achievements turned against it by enemies who preferred their former foes prostrate rather than prosperous. Attempts to defend through diplomatic channels only deepened suspicions about ultimate intentions. When ambassadors protested encroachments with elegant legal arguments, their very eloquence was taken as evidence of dangerous sophistication. When they offered additional tribute beyond requirements as proof of good faith, the gesture was interpreted as an attempt to buy time for sinister preparations. No action, however innocuous, could escape reinterpretation through the lens of predetermined hostility. Hannibal's presence became a particular source of anxiety for those determined to view recovery as a threat. The general who had once brought the Republic to the brink of destruction now served as chief magistrate, applying his legendary organizational skills to civilian administration. His reforms were transparently beneficial. Tax collection became more efficient. Public works projects employed thousands of citizens. Trade relationships were rationalized to mutual advantage. Yet his very competence was seen as ominous by those who preferred their enemies incompetent. The pressure eventually became unbearable, even for a man of extraordinary resilience. Faced with demands for his extradition that would certainly have led to execution, the great commander chose exile over surrender, slipping away from the metropolis that had been his life's work to seek sanctuary in the courts of Eastern rulers. His departure was intended to remove a source of friction between the powers, but it only intensified suspicions about what other secrets might be concealed. The final crisis emerged from the most mundane of causes, a dispute over grazing rights in territories whose ownership had been contested for decades. Herders, protected by forces, occupied lands that farmers claimed by ancestral right. When local magistrates attempted to resolve the matter through traditional legal procedures, they found themselves confronting armed bands whose presence seemed designed to provoke rather than resolve conflict. The response revealed how completely the constraints imposed by defeat had been internalized. Rather than mobilizing forces to expel the intruders, an action that would have been routine in earlier centuries, the government appealed to distant arbitrators for justice. Delegation after delegation crossed the sea to lay their case before senators who had already decided that any complaint was prima facie evidence of aggressive intentions. The final embassy, led by aged diplomats who remembered the Great Wars and understood the stakes involved, made one last attempt to preserve the détente through reason and legal precedent. Their reception in the Senate House was courteous but cold, their arguments heard with the polite attention due to representatives of a subordinate power. The verdict, when it came, was delivered with the finality of divine judgment. The North African capital had violated the spirit, if not the letter, of its obligations, and must accept whatever consequences the injured parties deemed appropriate. The return of these envoys to Africa marked the end of an era that had begun with such promise 5 decades earlier. The metropolis that had transformed defeat into prosperity, that had honored every obligation and exceeded every requirement, that had demonstrated beyond doubt its commitment to coexistence, found itself condemned by the very success it had achieved. The quiet era was ending, and with it, the last hope that 2 civilizations might share the Mediterranean without one destroying the other. As news of the Senate's decision spread through crowded streets, citizens who had known only the tranquil prosperity of the intervening decades began to grasp the magnitude of the crisis approaching. The workshops that had produced luxury goods would soon be converting to military equipment. The merchant craft that had carried cargoes would be fitted for war, and the generation that had grown up knowing only competition was about to learn the harsh realities of total conflict. The transformation was as swift as it was desperate. Hidden caches of weapons were brought forth from secret storage places. Veteran officers who had served in distant lands returned to offer their expertise, and the civilian population prepared itself for a siege that everyone understood would be fought not for conquest, but for survival itself. The bitter truce was over, and the final act of the great drama was about to begin. The declaration that crossed the Mediterranean in the spring carried with it the weight of inevitability. After decades of mounting tension and manufactured grievances, the Italian Republic finally found its pretext for finishing what Cato long demanded. The message delivered to the North African capital was brief and uncompromising. Submit to complete disarmament and relocate the entire population 10 miles inland, or face the consequences of defying the Senate's will. The ultimatum's terms were designed to be impossible. No civilization could survive abandoning its port facilities, the source of wealth that sustained the Phoenician metropolis for 7 centuries. The demand was not for submission, but for collective suicide, a deliberate provocation that justified the total destruction that remained the true objective. The senators who crafted these conditions understood perfectly well that no people could voluntarily accept such terms. In the council chambers, where Hannibal once planned his march to Italy, aged magistrates faced the most momentous decision in their history. The choices before them were stark: accept extinction through compliance, or choose annihilation through resistance. There could be no middle ground, no diplomatic escape from the trap that closed around them for 50 years. The bitter peace was ending exactly as its architects intended. The debate that followed revealed the profound transformation that occurred since the days of imperial grandeur. Gone were the merchant princes who once calculated profit and loss with cold precision, replaced by men who understood that honor might matter more than survival. The speakers who rose to address the assembly spoke not of commercial advantage or territorial expansion, but of the duty owed to ancestors who built this civilization from a handful of refugees fleeing royal persecution. When the vote came, it was unanimous. The Tyrian colony refused to abandon the site where Dido first set foot, refused to forsake the harbors carved from stone by generations of engineers, refused to surrender the temples where their gods received worship since before memory began. If destruction was inevitable, it came to a people standing in their ancestral home, rather than wandering as beggars through foreign lands. The preparations that followed moved with desperate efficiency. Hidden arsenals yielded weapons that had been secretly maintained despite treaty prohibitions, while workshops began the frantic conversion from peaceful production to instruments of war. The population, swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside, threw itself into defensive preparations, with the energy of people who understood they were fighting for more than mere survival. They were defending the last remnant of a world that vanished forever if they failed. The harbour that had once welcomed merchant vessels from every corner of the Mediterranean now bristled with hastily constructed fortifications. The circular naval basin, symbol of former maritime supremacy, was blocked with chains and floating obstacles designed to prevent amphibious assault. Every street became a potential battleground, every building a fortress, every citizen a soldier in what everyone understood would be the final struggle. The consular armies that crossed from Sicily in the summer represented the culmination of generations of military evolution. These were not the legions that had struggled against Hannibal. Learning through bitter defeat, how to adapt their tactics to enemy innovations. Instead, they embodied the mature power of a republic that had conquered the known world, their equipment standardized, their discipline perfected, their confidence absolute. Marcus Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus commanded forces that dwarfed anything previously deployed against African targets. 80,000 infantry, supported by cavalry, engineers, and the most advanced siege equipment available, established their camps around the doomed metropolis, like harbingers of divine judgment. The blockade that followed was total, cutting off not just military supplies, but the food that kept the defenders alive. Yet the opening months of the siege revealed that quantity alone could not overcome the advantages of prepared positions defended by desperate men. The massive walls that surrounded the metropolitan center had been strengthened with every engineering innovation developed over 7 centuries of existence. Behind them, a population that had embraced martyrdom fought with a ferocity that surprised attackers accustomed to enemies who sought reasonable terms once defeat became inevitable. The first assaults were repulsed with losses that shocked the besiegers. Defenders who had never seen combat before proved capable of extraordinary courage when fighting literally for their homes and families. Women and children worked alongside men to repair breaches, while craftsmen who had spent their lives creating objects of beauty now devoted their skills to instruments of destruction. The siege that should have ended in weeks stretched into months, as the attackers discovered they faced an enemy that preferred death to surrender. The failure of direct assault forced a change in command that would prove decisive for the conflict's outcome. Scipio Aemilianus, adoptive grandson of the victor of Zama, arrived to take control of operations that had stalled despite overwhelming numerical superiority. The younger Scipio brought with him not just fresh troops, but a systematic approach to siege warfare that left nothing to chance. Under his direction, the blockade became a masterpiece of military engineering. A double wall, stretching for miles around the entire perimeter, sealed off every avenue of escape or supply. The harbour mouth was blocked by a massive stone mole that required months to construct but made naval relief impossible. Most crucially, the siege lines were extended to encompass the entire metropolitan area, trapping not just the defenders, but every civilian who had sought refuge within the walls. The defenders' response to this methodical strangulation demonstrated both their ingenuity and their desperation. Working in secret, they carved a new channel through the harbour's southern wall, creating an outlet that bypassed the stone barrier. From hidden shipyards, a makeshift fleet emerged to challenge the blockade. Vessels constructed from temple furnishings and private dwellings that had been systematically dismantled to provide materials. This final naval sortie represented everything the Phoenician tradition had once embodied. Innovation born of necessity, courage in the face of impossible odds, and seamanship that had been passed down through generations of maritime experience. For a brief moment, it seemed that the ancient mastery of the waters might yet preserve the metropolis that had given it birth. But the effort came too late, and with too few resources to alter the fundamental balance of forces. The destruction of this improvised armada marked the end of organized resistance beyond the walls. With their last connection to the outside world severed, the defenders faced the stark reality that their struggle had become not a war, but a prolonged act of collective martyrdom. Food supplies dwindled to nothing. Disease began claiming victims faster than combat, and the population that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands shrank week by week. Yet even as starvation and plague accomplished what direct assault had failed to achieve, the spirit of resistance never broke. Survivors ate leather, tree bark, and worse to maintain their strength for fighting. Bodies were burned rather than buried, to deny the attackers the satisfaction of seeing their enemies' corpses. Most remarkably, no serious faction ever emerged to advocate surrender, despite the certain knowledge that death was the only possible outcome. The final assault began in the spring of the siege's third year, when Scipio's engineers had completed their methodical reduction of the outer defences. The attackers advanced through neighbourhoods that had been transformed into killing grounds, every building defended by people who understood they would not survive to see another dawn. The fighting was not warfare in any traditional sense, but something closer to ritual slaughter, as disciplined legions ground their way through a population that had chosen annihilation over submission. The last defenders retreated to the citadel on Bursa Hill, that sacred ground where Dido had first established her settlement 7 centuries before. Here, in temples dedicated to Tanit and Baal-Hamon, the final remnants of Phoenician civilization made their stand. When the Romans finally broke through, they found not soldiers, but families who had gathered to die together rather than face slavery or exile. Hasdrubal the Boeotarch, who had commanded the defense with skill that honored his ancestors, chose the bitter irony of surrender at the very moment when resistance became impossible. His wife, disgusted by what she saw as cowardice, threw herself and their children into the flames that were consuming the temple, rather than accept survival purchased through capitulation. Her gesture epitomized the choice that the entire population had made: death as free people rather than life as subject ones. For 17 days, the fires burned. Every building was systematically demolished, every street torn up, every trace of the civilization that had flourished here methodically erased. The harbours that had been engineering marvels were filled with rubble. The temples that had echoed with prayers for a millennium were reduced to foundations. The walls that had protected generations of citizens were scattered stone by stone across the African countryside. Scipio Aemilianus, standing amid the ruins of what had once been the greatest port in the Western Mediterranean, reportedly wept as he contemplated the magnitude of destruction. Quoting Homer's verses about the fall of Troy, he wondered aloud whether some future conqueror might one day stand amid the ruins of his own homeland, reflecting on the impermanence of all human achievements. The moment captured the tragic dimension of what had occurred. The elimination not just of a rival, but of an entire way of life. The symbolic gestures that followed the physical destruction were designed to ensure that the memory itself would perish. The site was formally cursed, its soil salted in a ritual that declared it unfit for human habitation. The survivors, perhaps 50,000 from a population that had once exceeded 500,000, were sold into slavery and dispersed across the Mediterranean, their children forbidden to speak the language of their ancestors or practice the customs of their homeland. Yet even this systematic attempt at cultural obliteration could not entirely erase what had been lost. In the decades that followed, Roman merchants would discover the need for exactly the kind of commercial networks that Phoenician traders had once maintained. The harbours would be rebuilt, the trade routes re-established, and a new settlement, Roman Carthage, would rise from the ashes of the old. But it would be a colonial outpost, a provincial centre, never again the heart of an independent civilization. The destruction of the Tyrian colony marked the end of more than just a single city or empire. With it died the last alternative to the Roman model of Mediterranean organization, the final example of a different way of organizing political and economic life. The world that emerged from the ashes would be more unified, more efficient, and more systematic than what had come before. But it would also be less diverse, less innovative, and less tolerant of the kind of cultural independence that had once flourished in the shadow of African hills. The great drama that had begun with Dido's flight from royal persecution had reached its conclusion in flames that could be seen across the sea. The Phoenician experiment in maritime civilization was over, its achievements becoming memories preserved in the histories of its destroyers. The Mediterranean would know peace, but it would be the peace of the grave, the silence that follows when all voices but one have been forever stilled. The silence that settled over the smoking ruins was profound, broken only by the distant crash of masonry still collapsing from the heat of fires that burned for 17 days. Where once the greatest port in the western Mediterranean hummed with the voices of merchants speaking a dozen languages, only the wind remained, carrying the scent of charred cedar and melted bronze across the desolate landscape. The Phoenician experiment in maritime civilization was over. In the months that followed the destruction, Roman administrators arrived to catalogue what remained of a culture that stretched back 8 centuries. They found treasures buried beneath collapsed temples, fragments of commercial records that revealed trading networks spanning 3 continents, and engineering marvels that their own experts struggled to comprehend. Yet for all their methodical documentation, they could not capture what truly perished in those flames. The accumulated wisdom of generations who understood the sea as others knew the land. Hannibal's story, meanwhile, was drawing to its own tragic conclusion in the courts of distant kingdoms. The man who once threatened to bring the Republic to its knees now wandered from patron to patron, his military genius reduced to entertaining dinner guests with tales of former glory. At Libisa, on the shores of the Bosporus, death finally claimed the last great champion of Punic independence. The poison he swallowed, rather than face Roman chains, carried with it the final hopes of those who remembered when eagles feared to cross the Mediterranean. The survivors dispersed across a world that no longer contained space for their identity. Children born into slavery forgot the language of their ancestors, while adults who remembered the harbor's golden age found themselves foreigners in lands their merchants once visited as honored guests. The commercial networks that sustained half the ancient world collapsed overnight, leaving gaps that Roman enterprise slowly filled with less flexible but more durable institutions. Yet the memory of what perished at those African walls lingered in ways the destroyers never anticipated. Roman poets composed verses about the tragic queen who founded the doomed metropolis, their imaginations fired by stories of love and loss that seemed more compelling than tales of administrative efficiency. Historians, even those who celebrated the Republic's triumph, wrote with grudging admiration of enemies who chose death over surrender, finding in their destruction something that elevated rather than diminished the human spirit. The site itself remained cursed ground for nearly a century, its harbours silted with rubble, its streets overgrown with African thorns. Travellers reported strange phenomena, voices carried on the night wind, shadows moving among ruins where no living thing stirred, the scent of incense from temples that no longer existed. Whether these manifestations were real or imagined mattered less than what they represented: the refusal of memory to accept the finality of obliteration. When Roman Carthage finally rose from the ashes, it bore no resemblance to its predecessor beyond geographical accident. The new settlement was a provincial centre, its straight streets laid out according to standard colonial patterns, its inhabitants drawn from Italy rather than the African interior. The magnificent harbours were rebuilt to serve Roman galleys, while temples to Jupiter and Mars replaced the ancient shrines where Tanit once received the prayers of seafaring peoples. The commercial revival that followed was impressive by any measure, except comparison with what came before. Roman merchants established profitable trade routes. Roman engineers constructed roads and aqueducts. Roman administrators imposed the kind of systematic organization that made their empire the envy of the known world. But the spontaneous innovation that once characterized Phoenician enterprise was gone, replaced by the methodical efficiency that served imperial purposes better than individual initiative. The wider Mediterranean world that emerged from this transformation was both more unified and more uniform than what preceded it. Roman law replaced the bewildering variety of local customs. Roman currency simplified transactions that once required complex calculations. Roman roads connected regions that isolation previously protected from outside interference. It was, by most measures, a better world, more prosperous, more secure, more rational in its organization. Yet something irreplaceable was lost in that efficiency. The cultural diversity that once flourished under the loose hegemony of competing powers gave way to conformity imposed by a single administrative system. Languages died out as Latin became the medium of advancement. Local traditions withered as Roman customs carried official sanction, and the experimental energy that drove innovation was channeled into serving imperial needs rather than exploring alternative possibilities. The memory of Carthage became a symbol that transcended historical fact, representing everything the Roman system eliminated in its march toward universal dominion. For later generations who chafed under imperial rule, the Punic metropolis embodied the road not taken, a vision of Mediterranean civilization based on voluntary cooperation rather than imposed unity, on commercial enterprise rather than military conquest, on cultural tolerance rather than administrative standardization. The irony was complete when Roman writers themselves began to romanticize the very enemies their ancestors destroyed. Virgil's Aeneid, that great epic of imperial destiny, devoted its most moving passages to the tragedy of Dido and the pathos of a love that could not survive the demands of historical necessity. The poet who celebrated Roman triumph understood that something noble perished with the queen who chose death over dishonor. Philosophers and historians of later centuries would debate whether the destruction was necessary for the greater good of Mediterranean unity, or represented a tragic failure of imagination that eliminated alternatives worth preserving. The question admits no easy answer, for both perspectives contain elements of truth. Rome did bring unprecedented peace and prosperity to regions that known only warfare and uncertainty under the earlier system of competing powers. But the cost of that achievement becomes clearer when measured against what was lost. The Phoenician genius for adaptation, the commercial networks that connected distant peoples in webs of mutual benefit, the cultural experiments that flourished in the spaces between great powers. All this vanished in the flames that consumed the African metropolis. The world that emerged was more orderly, but less creative, more secure, but less adventurous, more unified, but less diverse. The archaeological evidence that emerges from African soil tells its own story of civilizational richness that no amount of Roman efficiency could replicate. Phoenician craftsmanship reveals aesthetic sensibilities that valued beauty alongside utility, while commercial records document trading relationships based on trust rather than imperial command. Even the infamous child sacrifices, horror though they represent to modern sensibilities, suggest a religious intensity that found meaning in gestures that purely rational systems reject. The lesson, if there is one, lies not in condemning either civilization, but in recognizing what humanity loses when any single vision of organization achieves total dominance. The Mediterranean world was richer for containing both Roman discipline and Phoenician enterprise, both the systematic approach that built lasting institutions and the experimental spirit that explored new possibilities. When one eliminated the other, the survivors inherited a diminished heritage. The ashes scattered by African winds carried more than the debris of buildings and the bones of the defeated. They bore the final remnants of a way of life that understood power differently, that measured success by different standards, that found meaning in achievements that left no monuments for archaeologists to discover. The silence that followed their dispersal was not just the absence of sound, but the elimination of voices that might have spoken alternative truths about human possibility. Yet perhaps something survived in forms too subtle for imperial administrators to detect. In the courage of people who chose principle over survival, in the memory of beauty that transcended military utility, in the example of those who preferred death to the surrender of everything that made life meaningful. In these intangible legacies, the Phoenician spirit found a kind of immortality that no amount of systematic destruction could eliminate. The Mediterranean returned to its eternal rhythms, its waves washing shores that remembered empires in the strata of accumulated sediment. New powers rose and fell, new peoples crossed its waters seeking fortune or escape. New cities were built on foundations that contained the fragments of older dreams. But never again did its waters carry vessels guided by the particular genius that once made Carthage the queen of the sea, the bridge between worlds, the last alternative to the imperial future that became the only future the West has known. In the end, the story of Carthage becomes the story of all the roads not taken, all the possibilities foreclosed, all the alternatives eliminated in the long march toward whatever we choose to call progress. The fires that consumed the African metropolis burn still in the imagination of everyone who wonders what was lost, when diversity gave way to unity, when experiment yielded to system, when the many voices of the ancient world were reduced to the single voice of empire echoing across the centuries.